It was 3 a.m. when I found her. The hospital parking garage was almost empty, the fluorescent lights above buzzing softly, casting shadows across the cracked concrete. Sarah, my daughter, lay crumpled between two cars, her nurse's scrubs stained with dark, dried blood. Her breath was shallow, barely noticeable, and her face was ashen, lips trembling. I dropped to my knees without a second thought, ignoring the familiar ache in my joints that screamed for attention at my age of 72. Her eyes fluttered open just for a moment, and she whispered, her voice weak and hoarse. "Mom." She coughed, and a painful gasp escaped her lips. "It was Dr. Sutton. He said, we don't belong here. People like us, we're just the help. We're beneath them." The words barely made sense as they left her mouth, but I knew enough to understand. The same story, the same injustice I'd seen before. But this time it was my daughter. Before I could react, her eyes rolled back, and she went limp in my arms. Panic surged through me. I shook her gently, calling her name, but there was no response. I screamed for help, my voice echoing against the cold, empty walls. The sound of my voice was the only thing that seemed to cut through the heavy silence of the night. The cold rain started to pour, the water rushing down the concrete in streams, but I didn't care. I needed to know she was alive. I felt for a pulse, my hands shaking uncontrollably, but then there it was, faint, but steady. The relief was almost overwhelming, and I didn't hesitate. I screamed again, louder this time, and in moments, paramedics arrived, quickly assessing the situation. They recognized Sarah, and one of them whispered, "She's one of ours," under his breath. But all I could think about was the cruelty that had brought her here. I followed the paramedics as they took Sarah to the ambulance, my heart pounding in my chest. The ride to the hospital was a blur, the flashing lights of the ambulance illuminating the dark road ahead. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them good. I knew this hospital all too well. Memorial Hospital, the same place where Sarah worked, where I had spent 40 years of my life as a nurse. I retired a decade ago, but the walls of that place, the faces of the people I'd worked with, still haunted me. It was the same hospital that Dr. Jonathan Sutton's family had owned for decades. The Sutton family, wealthy, untouchable, a name that carried more weight in Memphis than any title or degree. Their power was undeniable, and as I sat in the waiting room, I realized just how small I had always been in comparison to them. Sarah survived the first night, but she remained unconscious for days. Those days felt like years. I didn't leave her side for a second, though I knew she was in good hands. The hospital staff was kind, especially the nurses who had worked alongside her. But there was something unsettling in the air. Whenever someone from the Sutton family passed by, a hushed silence fell over the room. People looked down, avoided eye contact, and whispered amongst themselves. It was a fear I recognized all too well, the kind of fear I had lived with for years, back when I had worked under the Sutton's thumb. It was on the 4th day that Sarah woke up, her eyes groggy and filled with pain. She turned to me, and with a broken voice, she told me everything. He falsified records, Mom," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He's been covering up mistakes, pretending patients were treated when they weren't." And when I confronted him, she trailed off, the memory too painful to relive. Dr. Sutton said to me that we were just the help, that I had no right to question him. He said we weren't even meant to be in their world. She choked on the words. I threatened to report him, and he followed me. He attacked me in the garage to keep me quiet. He said it was a lesson about knowing my place. I sat there, holding my daughter's hand, the full weight of what she was telling me sinking in. My blood ran cold. Dr. Jonathan Sutton. I knew that name well. He was the chief of surgery, the one who had taken over his father's legacy. The man who controlled everything in the hospital, in the community. But this wasn't just about a corrupt doctor. This was about power, the kind of power that crushed anyone beneath it. That afternoon, I called my sister Margaret. She was 4 years older than me, still living in the house we grew up in. The house had always smelled of old wood and lavender, a place where memories of our childhood lingered like dust on the shelves. Margaret was stubborn, and I knew she'd never left Memphis, never strayed far from the family home. But what I needed her for now was far more important than nostalgia. Maggie, do you remember what Mama told us? About the basement. The silence on the other end of the line was thick. You think it's about the Suttons, don't you? I hesitated, then said, Yes, I do. Mama, our mother, had worked at Memorial Hospital for over 3 decades. She'd started as a janitor, eventually working her way up to head of environmental services. But before that, she had cleaned offices, the very offices of Dr. Marcus Sutton, Jonathan's father. Margaret and I had always known there was more to Mama's quiet life than met the eye. She never talked much about her work, but as she got older, she'd grown more insistent on us checking the basement behind the water heater if anything ever happened to her. We had always dismissed it, thinking it was just some old superstition, some leftover habit from her years of hard work. But this was different. I told Margaret everything that had happened with Sarah, and as I spoke, I felt something shift inside me, something deep, something that had been dormant for years. We had been invisible for far too long, overlooked by everyone except the people who used our labor to build their empire. And now, it seemed, Mama had known all along. She had prepared us for this moment, for this fight. The next day, Margaret and I met at our childhood home. The basement smelled exactly as I remembered it, musty and damp, with old cardboard boxes piled high, a sign of time long past. We pulled back the heavy curtain of dust and opened the door to the basement. I had never expected to find what we did next. Behind the water heater, stacked neatly and organized, were 3 large plastic bins. They were labeled with dates: 1970 to 1985, 1986 to 1995, and 1996 to 1998. Inside the bins were hundreds of photocopied documents, medical records, billing statements, memos. All of them were meticulously organized. The first bin held documents from the early years when Dr. Marcus Sutton had systematically denied treatment to Black patients, marking their files with codes that indicated no resources available, when in fact, the real issue was race and insurance. Mama had documented every instance, every death caused by the denial of care. The second bin was filled with records from the late 80s and 90s, a time when the Sutton family's grip on power had tightened. The records showed how the family had created a 2-tier system where the wealthy received top-tier care, while the poor were shuffled through with barely any treatment. And then there was the third bin, the most recent one from the years just before Mama retired. It was filled with medical malpractice cases, surgical errors covered up, and patient deaths that were attributed to complications, even when the cause of death was preventable. Dr. Jonathan Sutton, now chief of surgery, was listed in almost every one of these cases. The documents were damning. Margaret sat down beside me, her hands trembling. How did she do this? How did she gather all this without getting caught? I shook my head, feeling a deep sense of awe and grief. She told me once she said that being invisible was her superpower. Nobody noticed the cleaning lady. She saw everything, heard everything, and when they were careless, she documented it. She knew someday someone would need this. Someone like us. I felt a surge of purpose, something sharp and clear. It was time to make the Suttons pay for what they had done. It was time to bring their empire down. We spent the rest of the day going through the documents, our hands shaking as we flipped through the stacks. Margaret and I worked in silence, except for the occasional whispered gasp when we uncovered something new. Each document told a story of exploitation, of power, and of lives destroyed by the Sutton family's greed and arrogance. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of betrayal. For years, I had trusted those people, worked alongside them, and never once suspected the depth of their corruption. Margaret sat back, rubbing her eyes, looking exhausted. This is enough to bring them down. But we need more. We need a plan. I nodded, my mind racing. I'm calling Jennifer. Jennifer Chen was a lawyer Sarah had mentioned once, a young attorney who specialized in medical malpractice and civil rights cases. When I spoke to her that evening, she didn't hesitate. She said she would be there in the morning. By the time Margaret and I woke up, Jennifer was already waiting for us at the kitchen table, her eyes scanning the bins of documents with a trained, focused gaze. The room was silent except for the sound of paper rustling as Jennifer examined everything we had found. She was quiet for a long time, her fingers moving deftly over the stacks of paper as though she was absorbing everything at once. Finally, she spoke. "This is unbelievable," she said softly. "But it's also a gold mine. You're right, this is everything we need. It's not just negligence, it's intentional, criminal conduct. Fraud, malpractice, racial discrimination, cover-ups. The magnitude of this is huge." She didn't have to tell me that. I had known it from the moment I first read those records. But hearing her say it out loud made everything feel more real and more terrifying. "We need to move fast," Jennifer continued, her voice steady. "I'll bring in a team. We'll need to get this to the right authorities, the FBI, the Department of Health and Human Services. But it won't be easy. The Suttons have influence, power, and money. We'll be going up against more than just a corrupt family. We're up against the system they've built." I felt a cold chill run through me. I had worked in that system for years. I knew exactly how ruthless it could be. But there was something in Jennifer's voice that gave me hope. She wasn't afraid. And if she wasn't afraid, maybe we didn't have to be either. Over the next few days, Jennifer and her team worked tirelessly, organizing the documents and building a case. She contacted the FBI, the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners, and the State Attorney General's office. The wheels of justice started to turn, slowly at first, but with each passing day, they gained momentum. 6 weeks after we found the bins, Jennifer called me with the news I had been waiting for. "They're coming," she said. "The feds are raiding Memorial Hospital, and the Suttons are going down." My heart raced as I hung up the phone. It felt unreal, but it was happening. We had done it. The Suttons were finally going to pay for their crimes. I couldn't wait to tell Sarah. She had been recovering, her body healing from the attack, but her spirit had been crushed. She had quit nursing after what happened, unable to continue working in a profession that had betrayed her so completely. But now I hoped this would give her some peace, some sense of justice. That afternoon, we sat in front of the television, watching the news unfold. Federal agents were everywhere, hauling out boxes of evidence from Memorial Hospital and the Sutton Medical Group offices. There was a sense of urgency, of finality, in the air as the cameras flashed. Dr. Jonathan Sutton was arrested at his mansion, his cold, arrogant face staring back at the cameras. It was a moment I had imagined in my darkest hours, but seeing it actually happen made everything feel more surreal. The trial took almost a year, and in that time, Sarah moved in with me. We spent countless hours talking about Mama, about everything she had known, and everything she had done for us. I watched my daughter heal, but the scars, emotional, psychological, were not so easy to erase. I knew what she had given up when she left nursing, and I feared for her future. She had always wanted to help people, to make a difference, and now she felt betrayed by the very profession she had loved. But as the months passed and the trial date loomed closer, Sarah began to find new purpose. She talked about starting a nonprofit organization to help medical whistleblowers, to protect people like herself who had dared to stand up to the powerful. I was proud of her, proud of the woman she was becoming, but I couldn't help but feel the weight of all the years we had spent living in the shadows of the powerful. The trial was long and arduous, but in the end, justice prevailed. The Sutton family's empire crumbled, piece by piece. Dr. Jonathan Sutton was convicted on multiple charges, including assault, battery, Medicare fraud, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, his medical license permanently revoked. His father, Dr. Marcus Sutton, was deemed too old to stand trial, but his wealth was stripped away in civil lawsuits that left the family penniless. The hospital was sold to a nonprofit organization, and the Sutton Medical Group was dissolved. The Suttons, once untouchable, were now nothing more than a cautionary tale. The news spread quickly, and people who had suffered under the Sutton family's reign began to come forward, sharing their stories. Sarah's courage had sparked something in the community, a wave of voices that had been silenced for too long. And even though she had left nursing, I knew that her legacy would live on in the work she was now doing, in the lives she was helping rebuild. The day the trial ended, I visited Sarah in her apartment. She was sitting on the couch, reading through the paperwork for her new nonprofit. Her face was tired, but there was a spark in her eyes I hadn't seen in months. She looked up when I entered, and a small smile tugged at her lips. "Mom, I think we really did it. I think we made a difference." I sat beside her, my heart swelling with pride. "We did," I said softly. "We did." 3 months after the trial, Margaret and I attended the ceremony at the newly renamed Community Medical Center. The dedication of the Rosa Rodriguez Patient Rights Office was a bittersweet moment for me. I thought of Mama, of everything she had done in silence, and I felt her presence with us in that room. The plaque read, "Rosa Rodriguez, Patient Rights Office, in memory of a woman who spent her life ensuring the truth would be heard." I touched the plaque gently, a tear slipping down my cheek. Mama had always known the truth would come out. She had waited for the right moment, gathered the evidence, and prepared us for the fight. And when the time came, we were ready. As we left the ceremony, I looked at Sarah, her arm linked through mine. We had won. And though it had been a long, hard journey, the truth had finally come to light. And somewhere I knew Mama was smiling. In the weeks following the ceremony, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The dust had finally started to settle around the scandal that had rocked Memphis, and the Sutton family's name, once a symbol of power and influence, had become synonymous with corruption and deceit. But even as the world moved on, Sarah and I continued to feel the weight of what we had gone through. The victory was bittersweet, and there were still days when the trauma of everything that had happened seemed too much to bear. Sarah had moved into her own apartment, still healing from the emotional scars left by her attack and the years of silence she had endured. She had decided not to return to nursing, at least not in the same way. Instead, she threw herself into her work with the nonprofit, helping to protect medical whistleblowers and advocating for patient rights. I watched her from the sidelines, my heart swelling with pride, but I also saw the cracks in her armor. There were moments when the pain would resurface, in her quiet moments, when she thought no one was watching. I tried to be there for her, offering support, though I didn't always know how. I could tell she was wrestling with guilt. She had always been the one to fix things, to make everything better for others, and now she was facing a new reality. She could no longer work in the same system that had betrayed her. But at the same time, she had uncovered a deep well of strength, a fire inside her that burned bright, pushing her forward. "Mom," she said to me one evening, sitting across from me in her small kitchen, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I've been thinking. I don't think I can ever go back to nursing, not in the same way. But I want to help people in another way. I want to teach others what I've learned, what to look for, how to protect themselves." I nodded, knowing that this was the beginning of something new for her. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Sarah. You've got the experience, and you've got the passion to make a real difference." She smiled, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "It's just hard. I'm not sure how to get started. I'm not sure if I'm ready." "You don't have to be ready," I said, reaching out to take her hand. "None of us are ever really ready for what life throws at us. But you've already done so much. You've already helped so many people just by telling your story. The rest will come, piece by piece." Sarah's eyes brightened, and I could see that her resolve was starting to form. It was going to be a long road ahead for her, but I believed she would find her way. After everything that had happened, I knew that Sarah had a strength that no one could take away from her. She had already taken down a powerful family, a family that had been untouchable for decades, and now she was ready to take on the world in her own way. Meanwhile, I found myself returning to my roots, back to the quiet life I had once known. After retiring from nursing, I had never really found a new purpose. I had filled my days with the mundane tasks of life, grocery shopping, cleaning, visiting old friends. But the events of the past year had awakened something inside me, something I hadn't realized had been dormant for so long. The fight for justice, the fight for the truth, it had ignited a fire inside me. 2. I began volunteering at the new patient advocacy office that had been established in Mama's name. It felt strange at first, walking through the hospital's new hallways, seeing the plaques, the signs, reminders of the battle we had fought. But I couldn't deny that it also felt right. This was where I was meant to be, where I could finally make a difference in my own way. I spent my days helping people navigate the complexities of the healthcare system, providing support to those who were too afraid to speak up, too intimidated by the power of the hospital system. And I found that in helping others, I was healing too. The work wasn't easy. I spent hours on the phone with insurance companies, trying to get approval for treatments that were being denied. I helped patients file complaints, and I listened to stories of suffering and frustration that mirrored my own experiences. But there was a sense of fulfillment that I hadn't felt in years. I was making a difference, even if it was in small ways. And I could feel Mama's presence with me every step of the way. One day, as I was leaving the office, I ran into an old colleague from my nursing days. Her name was Carla, and she had been one of the nurses who had worked alongside me at Memorial Hospital. We hadn't spoken in years, not since I had retired, but she gave me a warm smile when she saw me. "Rose," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "It's so good to see you again. How have you been?" I smiled, glad to see her, but I could sense the hesitation in her voice. Carla had always been kind, but I knew that the changes at the hospital had affected her too. She had been there long enough to see the things we all knew but never dared to speak of. "I've been good, Carla," I said, my voice steady. "I'm doing some volunteer work at the new patient advocacy office, helping people who've been hurt by the system." Her eyes widened, and she looked around as if to make sure no one was listening. "I heard about what happened with the Suttons. You and your daughter. You've done something no one thought could be done. You've exposed them. But I've got to say, I'm scared. I'm scared of what's happening to this place. The Suttons' influence is gone, but there are still people here who've been complicit in everything that went down." Her words hit me like a cold wind. I had suspected as much, but hearing it from Carla made everything feel more real. The battle wasn't over. The Sterlings had fallen, but their network, their influence, was still deeply ingrained in the system. It wasn't just about exposing one family, it was about dismantling the entire system that allowed them to thrive. "I know," I said softly, "but that's why we have to keep fighting. For the people who don't have a voice. For the people who are still too afraid to speak up." Carla nodded slowly, her face filled with understanding. "You're right. We have to keep pushing." As I drove home that night, I thought about everything that had happened. The fight was far from over, but we had made a dent. The truth had come out, and the powerful had learned the hard way that they weren't untouchable. They never noticed the quiet ones, the ones who worked behind the scenes, the ones who collected the evidence and waited for the right moment to strike. Mama had been right all along. The truth always comes out, eventually. But it takes patience, determination, and the courage to stand up, even when the odds are against you. And now, with Sarah's new nonprofit taking off and my work in the patient advocacy office, I knew that we were ready for whatever came next. We weren't just waiting for justice anymore. We were creating it. As the months went by, the fight for justice began to feel less like an uphill battle and more like a new way of life. Sarah's nonprofit, Voices for the Voiceless, began to gain traction, helping medical professionals who had witnessed corruption within the healthcare system and providing a safe space for those who had been silenced by fear of retribution. The work was often exhausting, and the challenges were numerous, but every success, no matter how small, reinforced the purpose behind it all. There were days when Sarah doubted herself, when the weight of what had happened to her seemed to overwhelm her. But I could see her strength, even when she couldn't. She had been through so much, and yet, she was still standing tall, fighting for others who had been hurt just like she had. It was hard to believe sometimes that this was the same young woman who had once feared speaking up. Now, she was a voice for the unheard, an advocate for change. One evening, as we sat together in her apartment, a familiar knock echoed on the door. It was Jennifer Chun, our lawyer, and now a close friend. She had been with us through every step of the legal battle, offering both her expertise and her unwavering support. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes as she entered the room, but there was also a sense of quiet determination. "I've got news," Jennifer said, taking a seat across from us. "It's not over. Not by a long shot." My stomach twisted. I had expected to hear something positive, but the tone in Jennifer's voice told me otherwise. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, her voice tense. "Remember how we were able to get the Suttons on federal charges for fraud and malpractice?" Jennifer began, her gaze flicking between Sarah and me. "That's only the tip of the iceberg. I've been looking into more of the Suttons' connections, and what I found is far worse than I could have ever imagined." My heart skipped a beat. "What kind of connections?" Jennifer hesitated, glancing at Sarah, then back at me. "There's more than just financial fraud. The Suttons were part of a larger network of corrupt medical professionals and politicians who used their power to control healthcare resources. They've been involved in a web of kickbacks, bribes, and insurance fraud for years. And the worst part? There are still people out there protecting them." I felt my blood run cold. I had known the Suttons were powerful, but this was more than I had ever imagined. They had not only built a hospital empire on the backs of the vulnerable, but they had embedded themselves deep within the system, ensuring their influence spread far beyond Memorial Hospital. "Are you saying there are still people at the hospital, or even in the system, who are still involved?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. "Yes," Jennifer replied, her expression grave. "And they've been working quietly to protect the Sutton legacy. If we don't act fast, they could bury everything we've worked for." I stood up, pacing the room as I processed the enormity of what Jennifer was saying. I had thought the battle was over. But this was only the beginning. "What can we do?" I asked, my voice steady, but filled with urgency. "How do we expose them if they're still hiding in the system?" Jennifer leaned forward, her eyes dark with determination. "We need to find the documents. The missing pieces. The ones that will connect the Suttons' actions to the people who are still protecting them. The hospital records, the financial transactions, anything that links them to the bribery and corruption. If we can get our hands on those, we can bring everything to light, once and for all." It was a daunting task, but it was the only way forward. The Suttons had used their wealth and power to protect themselves for decades, but they had underestimated the people they considered beneath them. We had already taken down one branch of their empire, but the roots of their corruption ran deep. Now we had to find the evidence to expose the rest of it. Over the next few weeks, Jennifer worked tirelessly behind the scenes, contacting former employees, investigating more of the Suttons' associates, and searching for the missing documents. Meanwhile, Sarah and I kept our heads down, continuing to work on the nonprofit and ensuring that the people who came to us for help were taken care of. But there was always the looming shadow of the Suttons, the knowledge that they were still out there, their influence still hanging over the city. Then one morning Jennifer called. Her voice was full of excitement, but there was a hint of caution, too. "We've found something. It's not much, but it's a start." I rushed to meet her at her office, my heart pounding in my chest. As I sat down across from her, she handed me a file. It was thin, but the contents inside were enough to set the wheels in motion. It was a financial statement from one of the Suttons' offshore accounts, showing multiple transactions with companies that had ties to local politicians and healthcare providers. The amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars, funneled through shell companies, all to avoid detection. "These are the kinds of transactions that no one would have thought to look for," Jennifer said, her voice low. "But this is just the beginning. With these documents, we can prove that the Suttons were laundering money and bribing officials to cover up their malpractice. We can go after the entire network, and we will." It was the breakthrough we had been waiting for. With these documents, we had a chance to bring the full extent of the Sutton family's corruption to light. But the stakes were higher than ever. Now that we were getting closer to the truth, I knew the fight would be more dangerous. The people we were going up against had spent years covering their tracks. They would stop at nothing to protect what they had built. As Jennifer began preparing the case, I thought back to everything we had been through. From the moment Sarah was attacked in that parking garage to finding Mama's carefully kept records in the basement, It felt like we had been preparing for this fight our entire lives. Now, we were finally ready to finish what we had started. The truth was coming, and it would be unstoppable.